This film is so bad. I hate it. It's so bad. I've recorded this so many times and I've never been able to get it right because I keep on going in different directions. There's so many things I hate about this film and want to critique and just rip apart, but I can't because I have to find a couple things that I hate really badly and just sort of focus in on them. But there's just so much to complain about. I thought that this was going to be easy. 2-hour, 45-minute runtime. It's super long and dull and lackluster and it's just not as good as the original. But no, this is just a film that is filled to the brim with bad storytelling decisions, bad acting, bad horror, and it just combines into one of the most inferior sequels I've seen in my entire life. So, where do we start? The characters are all now 27 years older. It's 27 years after the events of It Chapter 1, and now we're just sort of repeating it, because that's this whole story. The main thing of It Chapter 2 is that all of these characters basically have to confront their fears, but again. And I don't think that enough people understand how dull that is and how lazy that is, because it's just ground that's been discovered before, ladies and gentlemen. It's stuff we've all seen before. There's nothing new added to these characters. There's nothing more deep about them. It's just the same struggles they had last film. Like Bill, he's still struggling with the death of his brother, and Ben is still fat, and then Eddie still hates germs, and it's all, the same thing over and over and over again. The only one that gets more character to him is Richie, but besides that, every character goes through the same thing that they went through last film, and that shows an incredible lack of character growth, because these adult characters have not moved on from that. Even though they did conquer their fears, conquered what they weren't comfortable with in Chapter 1, they now revert back to those things in this film, and it's extremely uninteresting. And that's the entirety of the movie. So let's just talk about the structure of this film. So we start off, Pennywise is introduced, and then we get the characters, the gang back together. And it's one of the lamest getting the gang back together sequences ever. All of the character reintroductions are just really lame, really uninspired, a car crash, hooray, it's just so boring, just so uninteresting, and none of the characters' reintroductions, once again, feels like it adds anything. There's nothing that's added to their character from that moment on. They have different professions. Beverly's still struggling with bad men. Now Bill is a screenwriter who has an unhealthy marriage, but what does that have to do with anything? There's nothing here. There's nothing here to these reintroductions that makes it interesting. And even Avengers Endgame, which really botched the character reintroductions with just horrible choices in just reinventing these characters, at least the reintroductions were at least interesting because the characters were so different. But now there's just nothing here. The characters don't feel like they evolved, but at the same time, they also don't feel like themselves either, because the acting is just so bad. Stanley's actor, my lord, is that underwhelming. The suicide in the 1990 miniseries is so tragic, so disturbing, because of course it is, because suicide is really freaking disturbing. And in this film, it feels soulless. It feels scarily untragic. And that's not just a desensitivity to violence. I hate watching suicides on film. And this was just not heartbreaking or sad at all to watch. As for Bill Hader and the guy that plays Eddie, these guys feel like comedians lost in horror movies. They don't embody their characters at all. I saw that Bill Hader was getting Oscar buzz for this, which I just find hilarious. There's no way he'll get nominated for this, and rightfully so, because he's not that good. And just because a character has changed his weight, like Ben, doesn't mean you can remove his character. The grown-up Ben doesn't feel like Ben at all. It doesn't feel like he has any of the insecurity Ben had. And Beverly, Jessica Chastain, does not capture the softness and the warmth of that character. And so when we see her, getting abused once more, it doesn't feel nearly as scary and as frustrating as it should be. This is probably a career worst performance for James McAvoy. he just completely misses the mark. This doesn't feel like Bill at all. Just completely shoots in an opposite direction as the child actor shot in the first movie. Just pathetic, and Mike is the worst example of this because the actor who plays him, granted, this is mostly a writing problem. Mike is now just the exposition of the movie. That's it. He was an interesting character who had a serious past in the first movie, and now he just dumps a bunch of exposition onto these characters. And at the end, he just turns out to be a lying bastard because he just straight up lied to them and put all of their lives in danger. These characters are stuck in limbo because in terms of writing, they haven't changed at all, but in terms of acting, they feel like completely different characters, and it creates this weird dissonance that I can't quite explain, where nothing feels like it was hit. Nothing feels like it feels like the first movie. Nothing feels as though these child actors were brought to life as adults. And of course, then we have sequences where the child actors are brought on and they make all the adults seem like amateurs. They're hilarious. They get more emotion out of me than any of the adults do throughout the entire movie. Their scenes are just so fun, so entertaining to watch, and yet at the same time so poignant. It actually looked like they were a group of friends, but oh boy, does the main group of actors look like they could not be more uncomfortable. The reunion of the Losers Club is pitiful. It felt so authentic in the miniseries, and here it just feels cold. It feels like nothing is sparking between these actors. And there's a lot of jokes cracked here, sort of trying to rekindle the fire that was had in the original film, but once again, the mark is missed here. Nothing is actually hit. Nothing seems to have the impact that it actually should. And this goes double for all the jump scares and horror. But really, the horror and jump scares are just interchangeable because that's the same thing in this movie. As I predicted, this movie is all jump scares. That's all it is. Every single scene is set up, jump scare, set up jump scare, set up jump scare, set up fake out jump scare. There's nothing more to it. And because of the structure, which I'll get to in a couple of seconds, everything's the same. You can see it. It's cyclical. Every single scene plays out the exact same way. And nothing about this film has that slow burn that the first one sort of had linger in it. And of course, the fears itself don't even match up with the fears of these characters that much. It's sort of like they just wanted to make a bunch of random stuff come on screen that sort of seemed disturbing. Like, the most tense, most scary part of this movie was shown in the trailers. And that was a very conscious decision because I bet they knew that was the best scene in the movie. Usually, simpler horror like two characters talking is more scary than a bunch of weird-ass monsters. And that's the case with this film. That conversation between Beverly and that old woman is incredible. But it was incredible in the trailer. As for a piece of this film, kinda, non-emotional because it was shown in that trailer. Like, Pennywise doesn't even feel important anymore. He feels like he's just sort of there because he wants to fuck with them. Like, he doesn't feel like he's actually trying to tap into their fears that much. It's just, like, sort of sad. Like, he was this badass in the first film who was, like, preying on these children. He was really scary thanks to Bill Skarsgård and just everything surrounding with that character. And then in this film, he's just an asshole. Like, he's just an asshole trying to torture some lame adults. And I think a big part of that is because he shows up more in this film. Like, he constantly has to make himself aware. And that lingering presence of him just sort of in the background is more impactful than him constantly showing up. And this is where the whole really flawed structure of this film comes in. So, like, first act break into second act, Mike tells everyone that they have to get their tokens, their own MacGuffins. They all have to split up by themselves, and they need to get this very generic plot device in order to beat it. Could you make this any more of a boring and more predictable plot? Oh, they all go to their place and they have a flashback and then there's a jump scare at the end and then they want to quit and leave Derry by the end of the jump scare. La-di-da, la-di-da. It's the same thing over and over again. You know what's going to happen because they just do the same thing from character to character. And this ruins the whole point of the first film. The biggest strength of the first film is the dynamic between the characters, between these kids. And so what do? You split them all up so they feel as though they don't belong even more than you already feel, because none of these actors feel like they want to work together and make a coherent puzzle. They just want to go do their own thing. The division of these characters breaks this film. I cannot put that in simpler terms. This makes the film not work, because the whole point of that first film was the camaraderie of these kids working together to overcome their fears. They derived strength from each other, but in this film, that ain't it, Chief. They each have to go deal with their own shit in the entirety of the second act, which by itself is just way too long. And then there's this weird side plot with Billy and this little kid, and he fails to save him. But we're barely attached to the kid, so how are we supposed to feel anything? Hell, we're barely attached to any of these adult characters because they feel so foreign to us, so we're not really feeling anything from them either. Honestly, the fact that there's even an adult story makes the first triumph over it mute, because these characters are dealing with the same things they already overcame in that first film. There's just nothing right about this. There's nothing right about this movie. And then in the third act, they say, oh, there's only one place we can go to beat this thing. And I'm thinking, oh, the sewers, because that's where they beat it originally. And then they go to the haunted house. Like, why would you pick the second most important place in the entire film? Like, why not just go straight to the sewers? Just, oh, God. Oh, there's so much wrong with this. And then the bully, like, sort of is important, but not really. But the fight between him and Mike isn't nearly as impactful, because that hate, that seething hate that was there in the first film is not there. It's not there in this film, because nothing is actually well developed and none of the characters feel like their same old selves. And then we get to the climax, which is just pitiful, not only because of the jump scares, but just because it turns into a CGI mess, which of course I hate. And there's nothing more to be said. Like, it's all CGI. And considering I'm already not attached to the characters, it doesn't work by itself. But just the fact that it's like, it feels like it's 35 minutes just really, really pisses me off. And then they beat the clown by belittling it, by just saying it's nothing, by believing that it's not important. And that's like the same thing they've been doing throughout the entirety of the film, and yet it didn't work like that much. But then when they're together, it worked. But they were together and believed it wasn't scary at the beginning. It just makes no sense. They beat it the same way they beat it in the first film. But having a bunch of adults say to a clown, you're just a clown, you're not scary, it's lame. This film doesn't work because having a coming-of-age story overcome their fears is good. It works. Having a bunch of adults who have already overcome fears go back and overcome those fears by saying mean things to a clown and acting like they're children is just dumb. This story is so dumb. Like, I can't even stand it. Like, the actual writing behind this story is just unnaturally moronic. It's straight up moronic. And you know how I'm, like, stumbling through this. You see how I'm using the same words. You see how I'm chewing on a mint right now. But it's because I don't feel as though I should give my full time and attention to this film, because full time and attention was not given to this story or to this film. The actors are not nearly as good as the child counterparts. The actual story itself is redundant and goes back to the original fears in the first film that were already overcome. It's a non-scary horror movie. The structure is predictable as hell and defeats the purpose of the first film. The climax is embarrassingly long, and there's just nothing to gain from this film. It's all about a coming-of-age story. That is it. That's the beauty of it. And then you have a bunch of adults cursing at a clown, saying, fuck you, clown, at the end. What am I supposed to do with this movie? So am I supposed to, make a coherent review where I talk about it like an intelligent human being? No. This film sucks. I'm giving it a 3.5. It's garbage. Don't see it. That's it. Thank you. Have a good night.